The first thing you should know is that I'm writing this from a hospital bed. The doctors say I'm lucky to be alive after what happened in the Cascade Wilderness. They don't believe my story. They think exposure and dehydration caused hallucinations. Maybe writing it down will help me process what really happened out there, or at least convince someone that the danger is real. It started 3 weeks ago when my old college roommate Jake suggested a 5-day backpacking trip through Bitterroot National Forest. We hadn't seen each other in years, but we both needed to escape our lives for a while. I'd just gone through a messy breakup, and Jake was burning out at his corporate job. "This trail system is incredible," Jake said over the phone. "Miles of pristine wilderness with hardly any hikers. My buddy did it last summer and said they didn't see another person for days." That should have been my first warning. We arrived at the trailhead on a Tuesday morning in late September. The parking lot was empty, except for an ancient pickup truck with faded Montana plates. A thick blanket of fog hung between the towering pines, and the air smelled of damp earth and decaying leaves. Jake seemed nervous as we shouldered our packs. "I checked the weather before we left. Should be clear all week." But this fog wasn't on any forecast. It clung to us as we started down the trail, muffling our footsteps and conversation. 2 miles in, we passed a wooden sign riddled with bullet holes. Most of the text had been weathered away, but I could make out a few words: danger and do not. "What do you think that was about?" I asked. Jake shrugged. "Probably some old mining hazard or something." By late afternoon, we'd covered 12 miles. The forest had grown denser, the trees packed so tightly together that we could barely see 20 feet off the trail. We found a small clearing beside a creek and set up camp. As I gathered firewood, I noticed unusual markings carved into several trees, crude symbols that didn't look like standard trailblazes. Some resembled stick figures with elongated limbs, others like eyes with too many pupils. I took a photo but didn't mention it to Jake. No reason to spook him on our first night. After dinner, Jake pulled out a flask of whiskey. "My grandfather used to come up to these mountains," he said, passing me the flask. "He told me weird stories about them. Said the local tribes avoided certain valleys because they believed shapeshifters lived there." "Shapeshifters?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Yeah, creatures that could take human form. They called them skinwalkers." Jake's face was half hidden in shadow. "They'd mimic people's voices to lure them away from safety." I laughed it off, but something about Jake's expression made my laughter die in my throat. As darkness fell, the forest around us changed. The ambient sounds, birds, insects, the rustle of leaves, gradually faded until there was nothing but the crackling of our fire and the distant gurgle of the creek. The silence felt deliberate, as if the forest was holding its breath. At 2 a.m., I woke to a sound outside my tent, soft footsteps circling our campsite. I lay perfectly still, listening as they completed one circuit, then another. Whatever it was taking its time, methodically exploring our perimeter. I reached for my phone to use as a flashlight, but the battery had drained completely despite being at 80% when I'd gone to bed. The footsteps stopped directly outside my tent. "Jake?" I whispered. "You awake?" No response from his tent. The thing outside moved closer. I could hear its breathing now. A wet, ragged sound unlike anything I'd heard before. It sniffed audibly at the fabric of my tent, and I watched in horror as something pressed against the nylon, creating a shallow depression. It wasn't a hand or a paw. The shape was all wrong. Too many fingers, too long. After what felt like hours, it moved away. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, Jake was cheerful and well-rested. When I described what happened, he looked concerned. "Probably just a deer," he said, but his eyes darted nervously to the tree line. As we packed up, I noticed strange tracks in the mud by the creek, barefoot human prints that abruptly changed mid-stride into something with too many toes, spread unnaturally wide. I took a photo. Jake pretended not to notice. We hiked deeper into the forest that day. The trail narrowed and began to fade in places, forcing us to check our map frequently. We didn't talk much. Jake kept looking back over his shoulder, and I found myself jumpy at every snapping twig. Around noon, we came to a small cabin in a clearing. It appeared abandoned, with boarded windows and a partially collapsed roof. Jake wanted to explore it, but I refused. Something about it felt wrong, like it was placed there deliberately, a trap disguised as shelter. That night, we made camp on a rocky outcrop with good visibility. I convinced Jake to take shifts keeping watch. During my turn, I saw eyes reflecting our firelight from the forest edge, not at deer height, but at human height. When I shined my flashlight toward them, they didn't flee like an animal would. They blinked slowly, then retreated into the darkness. I didn't wake Jake. I was beginning to wonder if I could trust him. The next morning brought rain, a steady, cold drizzle that soaked through our jackets and made the trail treacherous with mud. Jake was uncharacteristically quiet, checking his GPS constantly despite the poor signal. "Are we lost?" I finally asked. "No," he said too quickly, "just making sure we're on track." By midday, the rain had stopped, but thick fog rolled in, reducing visibility to mere yards. We were hiking along a ridge when Jake suddenly froze. "Listen," he whispered. At first, I heard nothing. Then it came, a voice calling from somewhere in the fog ahead. "Hello? Is someone there? I need help." It sounded like a woman, her voice tight with pain or fear. Jake started forward, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait, there shouldn't be anyone else out here." "Someone could be hurt," he argued. The voice called again, closer now. "Please, I've been out here for days." Something about it raised the hairs on my neck. The pitch was almost right, but the cadence was wrong. Like someone who had learned human speech by observation rather than experience. "We should go back," I said firmly. Jake hesitated, then nodded. As we turned around, the voice changed. "Jake, is that you? Jake, don't leave me." My blood turned to ice. We hadn't called out our names. We quickened our pace. The voice followed, shifting positions impossibly fast, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind. It changed too, cycling through different tones and timbres as if trying to find one that would make us stop. "Why are you running? Don't you want to see me, Jake?" Jake's face had gone ashen. "How does it know my name?" We practically ran back down the trail until the fog thinned and the voice faded. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, Jake looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "What the hell was that?" he panted. I had no answer that wouldn't terrify us both further. We found a defensible campsite early that afternoon, a small clearing backed against a cliff face. While setting up the tents, I discovered a small bundle of sticks tied with what looked like human hair hidden under a rock near our site. It was arranged in the same pattern as some of the tree carvings I'd seen. Jake saw me examining it and turned pale. "We need to leave. Now." "It's almost dark," I pointed out. "We can't navigate the trail at night." "We can't stay here," he insisted, his voice rising. "Those are markers. It's hunting us." "What's hunting us, Jake? What do you know that you're not telling me?" He sat heavily on a log, head in his hands. "My grandfather didn't just tell stories about this place. He had an encounter here in the 70s. His hunting partner disappeared for 2 days, then showed up at camp acting strange. Wouldn't eat, hardly spoke. When they got back to civilization, the real partner was found dead 10 miles from their campsite." A chill ran through me. "You knew about this place and still brought us here?" "I thought they were just stories," Jake cried. "Old legends to scare kids." As darkness fell, we built the biggest fire we could manage and sat back to back, scanning the tree line. Around midnight, I spotted movement at the edge of the firelight, a figure standing just beyond the clearing. It was roughly human-shaped but wrong in subtle ways. Too tall, limbs too thin, joints bending at impossible angles. "Jake," I whispered, "don't turn around. There's something watching us." I felt him stiffen. "Where?" I gestured slightly with my chin. "Between those 2 pines. The figure hadn't moved. It stood unnaturally still, like a photograph of a person rather than a living thing. I reached slowly for my phone to take a picture, but as soon as I moved, the figure retreated into the darkness. Minutes later, we heard it circling our camp, quick, light footsteps that no human could make. Then came the voices. Not just one now, but several, all calling from different directions. Some sounded like children, others like elderly men and women. They called our names, pleaded for help, made promises of safety and rest. One voice cut through the others, a perfect imitation of Jake's. It came from directly behind us, though Jake sat right beside me. "We should split up," it said in Jake's exact tone. "Cover more ground." The real Jake gripped my arm so hard it left bruises. Throughout the night, the voices continued, occasionally interrupted by a sound like dry branches breaking, but higher pitched, more like bones splintering. Neither of us slept. By dawn, the clearing was silent again, but we found dozens of those stick bundles arranged in a perfect circle around our campsite, none of which had been there the night before. We packed in grim silence and abandoned our planned route, heading directly for the nearest ranger station marked on our map. The sun climbed higher, but the forest remained oddly dark, as if the canopy had thickened overnight to block the light. As we hiked, I felt watched from every direction. Twice, I caught glimpses of something moving parallel to our path, a tall, emaciated figure that ducked behind trees whenever I turned to look directly at it. By mid-afternoon, we knew we were being herded. Every time we tried to turn east toward the ranger station, we'd encounter an impassable obstacle, a sudden ravine, an unnaturally dense thicket, or once, a wall of fog so thick it was like walking into milk. Each detour pushed us deeper into the wilderness. "It's playing with us," Jake said, his voice hoarse from fear and exhaustion. I checked the GPS again. According to this, we've been walking in circles for hours. That's when we found the cameras. They were old-style trail cameras strapped to trees, positioned to cover multiple angles of the path. Some looked recently placed. Others were so weathered they'd been partially absorbed by the growing bark. "Rangers monitoring wildlife?" Jake suggested hopefully. I examined the nearest camera. No government markings, no official tags, just a custom-built device with a handwritten label. Subject 37, Migration Patterns. Further down the trail, we found more, dozens of them, forming a surveillance network through this section of forest. Some had small solar panels attached. None of them looked like standard wildlife monitoring equipment. Someone's been watching this thing, I realized. Studying it. Or working with it, Jake said darkly. We hurried on, desperate to escape the electronic eyes. The trail descended into a valley where the trees grew impossibly close together, their trunks twisted and fused in places like they'd been melted together. The ground was littered with animal bones, mostly deer and elk, but some I couldn't identify. Near a stagnant pool of water, we found a backpack partially buried in leaves. The fabric was new, the brand recognizable. Inside, energy bars, water purification tablets, a high-end digital camera, and a journal. The last entry was dated just 3 weeks earlier. Day 4. It's mimicking bird calls now. Perfect imitations of robin, thrush, even a barred owl. But it adds notes that don't belong, extra syllables that make my skin crawl. It's learning, adapting. The skin lesions are spreading up my arm. I don't think it's an infection anymore. Something watches me sleep. I wake to find new markings on my tent, symbols scraped into the fabric that weren't there before. The local legends call it the one who watches from the trees. I think that's literal. It wants me to know it's there. The journal ended abruptly. On the final page was a crude drawing of a tall, skeletal figure with too many joints and fingers. The face was blank except for eyes drawn as spirals. We left the backpack where we found it and pushed on, driven by growing panic. The sun was sinking fast, and neither of us wanted to be in that valley after dark. As twilight deepened, we heard it behind us. A rapid, uneven gait, like someone running on all fours. We broke into a sprint, abandoning any pretense of caution. The sounds followed, gaining ground with each passing second. Jake stumbled on a root and went down hard. I turned back to help him up and caught my first clear glimpse of our pursuer, illuminated by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the trees. It moved like a human, but wasn't one. The proportions were wrong, limbs too long and jointed in extra places, fingers extended like talons. Its skin was stretched tight over its frame, with patches that seemed to shift and ripple like poorly fitted clothing. The face was the worst part, almost human but with features that seemed to blur and rearrange themselves as I watched. I hauled Jake to his feet and we ran blindly through the gathering darkness. Behind us, the thing let out a sound that started as laughter and morphed into something else, a high, keening wail that echoed through the trees. We crashed through the forest until we spotted a faint light ahead, a cabin with a single illuminated window. Without discussing it, we sprinted toward it, our only hope of shelter. The cabin door was unlocked. We burst inside and slammed it shut, fumbling for a lock or barricade. The interior was sparse but lived in. A wooden table, chairs, a wood stove, and shelves lined with canned goods and books. A kerosene lamp burned on the table. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone here?" No answer, but the cabin felt recently occupied. The lamp was lit, and a coffee mug on the table was still warm. Jake dragged a heavy chair to the door while I checked the single window, securing its shutters. On the table lay an open notebook filled with meticulous handwriting and detailed sketches. It appeared to be research notes, observations of the thing in the forest, cataloging its behaviors and abilities. One page held a map of the area with dozens of X marks, encounter sites, according to the legend. They formed a pattern, a spiral centered on a point deep in the wilderness marked simply as Origin. Another page contained a list of names and dates stretching back decades. Missing hikers, I realized with a chill. Some had confirmed, written beside them in red ink. Others were marked transformed or mimicked. "Jake, look at this," I said, turning to a page with photographs. The images showed a progression of human figures with subtle abnormalities, elongated fingers, joints that bent at wrong angles, eyes with misshapen pupils. The final photo showed a man whose skin appeared to be peeling away at the edges, revealing something else underneath. The caption read, "Final stage before complete integration. Subject maintained partial awareness for 72 hours post-transformation." Jake backed away from the table. "We need to get out of here. Whoever owns this cabin is—" A thump on the roof cut him off, then another. Something heavy was moving above us. Dust drifted from the ceiling as the thing moved across the roof. Its footsteps were deliberate, testing different sections as if searching for a weak point. We stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. "The cellar," Jake whispered, pointing to a trapdoor in the floor. "We can hide." I hesitated. Something about this cabin felt wrong, too convenient, too perfectly placed along our path. But with the thing circling overhead, we had no choice. Jake lifted the trapdoor, revealing a wooden ladder descending into darkness. The smell that wafted up was damp and organic, with an undertone of something sickly sweet. "I don't like this," I said. "Better than up here," Jake replied, already lowering himself down the ladder. I followed reluctantly, pulling the trapdoor closed above us. In the darkness, I fumbled for my phone to use as a flashlight. The battery had mysteriously recharged itself to 50%. Impossible, but I wasn't questioning good fortune. The beam revealed a space larger than expected. The cellar extended well beyond the cabin's footprint, with rough-hewn tunnels branching off in several directions. The walls were lined with shelves holding labeled specimen jars, their contents floating in cloudy liquid. Equipment that looked medical in nature sat on metal tables alongside more mundane tools, axes, saws, hunting knives. "What is this place?" Jake whispered. Before I could answer, a noise from above silenced us, the cabin door opening followed by footsteps on the floorboards. Someone had entered. We retreated deeper into the cellar, following the largest tunnel. It sloped downward, carving through the earth for at least 100 yards before opening into a chamber that stopped us in our tracks. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, documenting decades of the forest entity. Some dated back to the 1930s, showing the same elongated figure watching from between trees. Others showed people in various stages of transformation, their bodies distorting in ways that defied biology. In the center of the room stood a metal examination table surrounded by sophisticated equipment that looked out of place in this underground setting. Beside it, a modern computer hummed quietly, its screen displaying a topographical map of the forest with dozens of blinking dots. The cameras, I realized. Someone's been studying it for generations, I said, moving closer to examine the wall of photos. That's when I saw them. Pictures of Jake. Dozens of images showing him hiking through the forest over multiple trips, unaware he was being photographed. Some were recent, others years old. Jake, I said slowly, turning to face him. Why are there pictures of you here? His expression changed, a flicker of something cold and calculating before returning to fear. I don't know. I've never seen this place before. But he was lying. I could see it in his eyes, in the way he wouldn't look directly at the photos. You've been here before, I said. Multiple times. Why did you really bring me here? Jake backed away, hands raised. You don't understand. My grandfather wasn't just telling stories. He was part of this. They've been studying it for generations, trying to understand it. Who's they? Scientists, researchers, people who know the truth about what lives in these forests. His voice had changed, becoming more assured. They've documented dozens of these entities across the country. This one is special, older, more intelligent. It doesn't just mimic, it transforms people. Footsteps approached from the tunnel behind us. Jake didn't react, didn't even turn around. You led me here? I realized with horror. I was never your friend, was I? I was bait. Not bait, he corrected. A potential host. The entity needs fresh genetic material to evolve. Not everyone is compatible. The footsteps stopped at the chamber entrance. I turned to see an older man holding a rifle, not pointed at me, but ready. You shouldn't have brought him to the cabin, Jacob, the man said. This area was supposed to be observation only. It was following us, Jake replied. I didn't have a choice, grandfather. The old man stepped fully into the light. I could see the family resemblance, the same eyes as Jake, but colder, more calculating. What happens now? I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. Now we wait, the old man said simply. It's already chosen you. The process has begun. You just don't recognize the symptoms yet. As if on cue, my skin began to itch, a deep crawling sensation that had been building gradually over our journey. I'd attributed it to stress and fear, but now I noticed fine hairline cracks appearing on the back of my hands, like dried mud beginning to flake away. What have you done to me? I whispered. We haven't done anything, Jake said. It chose you days ago, at our first campsite. The stick bundles aren't just markers. They're transmission vectors, containing a biological agent that prepares potential hosts. You can't leave the forest now, the old man added. The transformation only completes in its territory. Outside, you'd just get sick and die. The room seemed to spin around me. I leaned against the wall for support, feeling the cracks in my skin widen slightly, revealing something dark and membranous underneath. There must be a way to stop it, I pleaded. Jake and his grandfather exchanged glances. We can try, the old man said eventually. We've developed treatments that might slow the process, but you'd need to stay here, under observation. Another test subject, another jar on their shelf. I lunged for the door, surprising them both. The old man's rifle came up too late as I sprinted down the tunnel toward the cellar. Behind me, I heard Jake shouting, then the sound of pursuit. I emerged from the cellar into the cabin to find it transformed. The door hung open, splintered from its hinges. Claw marks scored the walls and furniture. Something had attacked while we were below, or been letting itself in. Outside, dawn was breaking. I ran blindly into the forest, no plan beyond putting distance between myself and that terrible cabin. The skin on my arms was cracking more rapidly now, peeling away in small flakes that dissolved into dust when they hit the ground. I ran until my lungs burned, then stumbled on through sheer desperation. The forest around me had changed, or perhaps my perception of it had. The trees seemed to watch me pass, their branches reaching slightly toward me as if in welcome. I heard Jake and his grandfather calling my name, their voices fading behind me. Then other voices joined in, whispers from the forest itself, speaking words I almost understood. I don't remember much after that. Park rangers found me 3 days later, unconscious and severely dehydrated at the edge of a service road. My skin was covered in a severe rash that doctors later diagnosed as an allergic reaction to an unknown plant toxin. That was the official explanation. I had gotten lost, suffered exposure and dehydration, and hallucinated most of my ordeal. They found no cabin, no underground laboratory, no evidence of Jake or his grandfather. According to official records, I had registered to hike alone, but I know what I saw. I know what began to happen to me in those woods. The doctors say I'm recovering well, but sometimes when I look in the mirror, I catch glimpses of something else looking back. Something familiar, yet utterly alien, peering through my eyes from somewhere far away. The cracks in my skin have healed, but beneath certain lights, I can see faint patterns just under the surface, like veins that don't follow human anatomy. Sometimes I hear voices calling from the woods behind the hospital. They sound exactly like the nurses and doctors who care for me. I know it's still out there, and I know that, in some small way, it's inside me too. They're releasing me tomorrow. I've told them I'm going home to recover, but the forest is calling, and part of me wants to answer. I remember that Friday afternoon in late September, when I suggested the camping trip. The 4 of us were sitting in Kathy's basement, our usual weekend hangout spot. I was 23 then, working a dead-end job at the hardware store, desperate for something to break the monotony. "There's this place about an hour north," I said, spreading out a wrinkled map across the coffee table. "My uncle mentioned it years ago, said it was perfect for camping, secluded, quiet, off the regular trails." Kathy looked skeptical, twirling a strand of brown hair around her finger. She was always the cautious one of our group. "Is it even legal to camp there? Sounds like private property." "It's not marked," I insisted. "Just this patch of woods between the state park and some farmland. People go there all the time." That wasn't entirely true. I'd only heard vague stories about the area. Hunters occasionally mentioning strange sounds, or hikers who'd gotten disoriented despite following what seemed like straightforward paths. But I kept those details to myself. "I'm in," said Wes, our resident thrill seeker. "Been too long since we did something interesting." He had that familiar gleam in his eye, the one that usually preceded questionable decisions. "Count me out," muttered Kathy. "Last time we followed your adventure ideas, I ended up with poison ivy for 2 weeks." "Come on," I pleaded. "One night. We'll bring extra supplies, good flashlights. It'll be fun." "I'll go if Kathy goes," offered Blake, always the peacemaker. He'd been friends with Kathy since grade school and rarely did anything without consulting her first. The room fell silent as we all looked at Kathy. She sighed, recognizing her defeat. "Fine. But if anything happens, anything at all, we're leaving immediately. No arguments." "Deal," I agreed, too quickly. We spent the next hour planning, making lists of supplies, checking weather forecasts. It was supposed to be clear skies, cool but not cold, perfect camping weather. What I didn't tell them was why I really wanted to go there. 3 weeks earlier, I'd been driving past that area and had pulled over, drawn by something I couldn't explain. Standing at the edge of those woods, I'd felt watched. Not threatened exactly, but acknowledged. Like the forest itself had noticed me. I'd walked a few yards in, heart hammering in my chest, before a series of rapid snapping sounds, too deliberate to be branches falling naturally, sent me scrambling back to my car. I needed to know what was out there, and somehow I felt safer bringing friends along. How naive we were, how unprepared for what awaited us in that silent stretch of wilderness. If I could go back to that moment in Kathy's basement, I would have ripped that map to shreds. The following Saturday, we piled into Wes's battered Subaru, the trunk stuffed with our gear. The excitement was palpable, a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that made even mundane conversations feel charged with significance. "Take the next right," I instructed, consulting my phone's GPS. The signal was already weakening as we ventured farther from the main highway. "You sure about this?" Blake asked, peering out the window at the increasingly rural landscape. Fields of corn stretched out on either side, creating natural walls that seemed to guard whatever lay beyond. "Positive," I lied. In truth, I was navigating partly from memory, partly from intuition. The roads had started to look different from what I remembered during my solitary drive weeks earlier. As we bounced along deteriorating asphalt, Wes attempted to lighten the mood with jokes about axe murderers and abandoned mental institutions. Nobody laughed, but we forced smiles, pretending it was all in good fun. An hour later, we reached the unmarked dirt path that I believed led to our destination. Wes pulled the car off the road, partially concealing it behind a cluster of overgrown bushes. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows across the landscape. "We should hurry," Kathy noted, checking her watch. "I don't want to set up camp in the dark." We shouldered our packs and began walking, first through the edge of a cornfield where the stalks stood unnaturally tall, brushing against our shoulders. The soil felt soft underfoot, yielding in a way that made each step slightly unsettling, as if the earth itself was too thin, covering something else. "This doesn't look like a trail," Blake observed as we pushed deeper into the field. The narrow path we followed seemed to disappear and reappear at random intervals. "It's not official," I admitted. "More like a game trail or something locals use." Eventually, the cornfield gave way to proper forest, a wall of trees that seemed to materialize suddenly, their trunks packed tightly together like sentries. The temperature dropped noticeably as we crossed this threshold, sunlight filtering weakly through the dense canopy. "Jesus," Wes began, then caught himself. "God, it's like stepping into a refrigerator." I led our small procession, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. My boots kept catching on gnarled roots that seemed to emerge from the ground without warning. Behind me, Kathy's breathing grew increasingly labored, punctuated by the sound of her swatting at insects that buzzed persistently around her face. "You okay?" I called back without turning around. "Fine," she replied tersely. "How much farther?" "Not far," I said. Another lie. Truth was, I had no idea how far we needed to go. I was looking for a feeling more than a place. That same sense of being noticed that I'd experienced before. After an hour of hiking, the forest seemed to thin slightly, revealing a small clearing where the underbrush was less dense. Something about it felt right. Secluded but defensible. Open enough to set up our tents, but enclosed enough to feel sheltered. "This is it," I announced, dropping my pack to the ground. The others followed suit, relief evident in their expressions. None of us noticed how quiet it had become, or how the wildlife, birds, insects, even the wind in the trees, had fallen completely silent the moment we entered that clearing. Setting up camp provided a welcome distraction from the oppressive silence that had settled around us. Wes struggled with the tent poles, cursing under his breath whenever they refused to connect properly. Blake gathered stones for a fire pit, methodically arranging them in a circle. Kathy unpacked our food supplies, organizing them with her characteristic precision. I found myself drawn to the perimeter of the clearing, restlessly pacing its edges. Something felt off about this place, but I couldn't pinpoint what exactly was bothering me. The trees seemed normal enough, a mix of oak, maple, and pine typical for this region. The ground was covered in a thick carpet of dead leaves and pine needles. Nothing unusual. And yet... Anyone else notice how quiet it is? Blake finally verbalized what we'd all been feeling. I haven't heard a single bird since we got here. Kathy paused her unpacking. Maybe we scared them away. All of them? Wes countered, momentarily abandoning his battle with the tent. Not even squirrels or chipmunks. Nothing. I tried to rationalize it. It's getting late in the season. Animals might be less active. Nobody seemed convinced, least of all me. By the time we finished setting up, the sun had nearly disappeared, plunging the forest into premature darkness. We huddled around our small fire, its warmth providing comfort against the rapidly cooling air. Our conversation felt forced, unnatural, as if we were all performing for an unseen audience. Remember that time in high school when we broke into the old mill? Wes was saying, trying desperately to recapture our usual camaraderie. Blake was so scared A sound interrupted him. A distinctive crack of a branch breaking, not close but not distant either. We all froze, eyes darting toward the source. Probably just a deer, I offered, not believing it myself. We resumed talking, but with less enthusiasm. Every few minutes, another sound would emerge from the darkness. Another snap, a rustle of leaves. Once even what sounded like a dragging noise, slow and deliberate. It's circling us, Kathy whispered after the third or fourth occurrence. None of us contradicted her. I retrieved a flashlight from my pack and directed its beam toward the trees. The light seemed to penetrate only a few yards before being swallowed by the darkness. I saw nothing unusual, just trees and underbrush, but the feeling of being observed intensified. I'm going to check it out, I announced, standing up. Don't, Blake said, with unexpected firmness. Whatever it is, let it be. I sat back down, secretly relieved for the excuse to stay by the fire. As the night deepened, so did our unease. The sounds continued at irregular intervals, never close enough to identify but never far enough to ignore. We took turns keeping watch, though none of us explicitly acknowledged what we were watching for. During my shift, while the others dozed fitfully in the tent, I noticed something that sent tendrils of fear crawling up my neck. The sounds had stopped, completely stopped, but in their place was a subtle difference in the air pressure, as if something large had moved very close to our campsite. I strained my eyes, scanning the tree line, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure. Just a shadow, really, slightly darker than the surrounding darkness, standing perfectly still between two distant trees. When I blinked, it was gone. I didn't wake the others. What could I say? That I'd seen a shadow? That the forest felt wrong? Instead, I fed more wood to the fire and waited for morning with growing dread. Around 2 a.m., Wes emerged from the tent to relieve me of my watch duty. His eyes were puffy from interrupted sleep, and he moved with the cautious alertness of someone entering hostile territory. Anything? He asked, settling beside me near the dwindling fire. I hesitated. Not really. Some noises earlier, but it's been quiet for the last hour. Too quiet, he muttered, poking at the embers with a stick. This place gives me the creeps. I nodded, reluctant to return to the confines of the tent, but equally uncomfortable staying out in the open. Wake me if anything happens. Define anything, Wes replied with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Inside the tent, Blake and Kathy were sleeping fitfully. Blake had positioned himself protectively near the entrance, while Kathy had burrowed deep into her sleeping bag, only the top of her head visible. I squeezed into the remaining space, trying to find a comfortable position on the hard ground. My mind refused to quiet. Every slight movement of the tent fabric, every subtle shift in the ambient sounds of the forest, registered as a potential threat. Exhaustion eventually pulled me into a shallow sleep filled with fragmented dreams. I woke abruptly to the sound of Blake's voice, urgent and tight with fear. Guys, wake up. Now. The tent was bathed in the gray light of early dawn. Blake was sitting upright, perfectly still, listening intently. "What is it?" Kathy whispered, emerging from her cocoon. "Someone's out there, walking around the tent." Now that we were all alert, we could hear it clearly. Soft footsteps circling our campsite, methodical and unhurried. They paused occasionally before continuing their orbit, each pause lasting just long enough to suggest observation. "Wes?" I called out, suddenly remembering our friend who should have been keeping watch. No response. "Wes!" Blake hissed, louder this time. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. Expectant, calculating. "I'm going out," I declared, reaching for the tent zipper. Kathy grabbed my arm. "Are you insane? We don't know who's out there." "Exactly why I need to check. Wes could be—" I couldn't finish the sentence. The tension was broken by Wes's voice, coming from somewhere across the clearing. "Guys, you up?" Relief flooded through me. "We're in the tent," I called back. "Where are you?" "By the trees. Found something weird. Come look." Something in his tone made my skin crawl. It was Wes's voice, unmistakably so, but there was a flatness to it, an absence of his usual inflections. "Tell us what you found," Blake countered, apparently sharing my unease. A pause. "You have to see it." The three of us exchanged glances. Kathy shook her head almost imperceptibly. "We're coming out," I announced, making a decision. "Just give us a minute." I grabbed my pocket knife, a laughably inadequate weapon, but it was all I had, and unzipped the tent slowly. Morning light filtered through the trees, creating a hazy, diffused glow that somehow made the forest look more alien than it had in darkness. We emerged cautiously, scanning the clearing for Wes. The campfire had burned out completely, leaving only cold ash. Our supplies remained untouched where we'd left them. "Wes?" I called again. No answer. "He said he was by the trees," Blake pointed out unhelpfully. Trees surrounded us in every direction. We stood back to back, turning slowly in a circle, searching for any sign of our friend. The forest remained stubbornly empty and silent. Then we heard it again. Wes's voice, now from a different direction entirely. "Over here, hurry!" Without discussion, we moved toward our supplies, grabbing essential items and stuffing them into our day packs. Whatever was happening, we needed to be mobile. "Wes, if that's you, come to the camp right now," I shouted, trying to sound authoritative despite my racing heart. Rustling from the underbrush, movement between distant trees. Nothing definitive. "We need to find him," Blake insisted. "We can't just leave." "We're not leaving," I assured him. "But something's not right. We stick together, no matter what." Kathy nodded grimly, tightening the straps on her pack. "If that's really Wes, he'll come to us." As if in response, we heard what sounded like laughter, distant and muffled, but recognizable as Wes's distinctive chuckle. It was coming from deeper in the woods, away from the path we'd used to reach the clearing. "That's not him," Kathy whispered. "It can't be." But even as she spoke, doubt clouded her eyes. What if it was Wes? What if he was injured or disoriented? Could we really abandon our friend based on nothing more than a feeling? The laughter came again, closer this time. Beckoning. "We go together," I decided. Carefully. At the first sign of trouble, we run. Back to the car, back to civilization. With trembling hands, I picked up a sturdy branch that could serve as a makeshift weapon. Blake and Kathy did the same. Side by side, we advanced toward the source of the sound, leaving the relative safety of our clearing behind. The forest grew denser as we moved away from our camping spot, the trees pressing closer together as if conspiring to slow our progress. Visibility extended only 20 or 30 feet in any direction before the woods dissolved into a confusion of shadows and overlapping trunks. "Wes!" Blake called out periodically. His voice sounded muffled, absorbed by the thick vegetation instead of carrying through the air as it should have. I checked my phone, No signal, as expected, but the time read 6:17 a.m. The early morning light should have been strengthening, yet the forest floor remained in twilight, as if the canopy overhead had thickened specifically to block out the sun. "This doesn't make sense," Kathy muttered, voicing what we were all thinking. We couldn't have gone that far from the clearing. She was right. We'd been walking for no more than 15 minutes, maintaining what I thought was a straight line toward the source of Wes's voice. But when I turned to look behind us, I could no longer see any sign of our campsite. "I think we should go back," Blake suggested, anxiety evident in his voice. Before I could agree, we heard it again. Wes's laughter, now seeming to come from somewhere to our right. "Guys, you're going the wrong way." His voice was clearer now, almost normal. Against my better judgment, I changed course, heading toward the sound. Kathy and Blake followed reluctantly. "If this is some kind of prank..." Kathy left the threat unfinished. The ground began to slope downward, gradually at first, then more steeply. The soil became softer, almost spongy underfoot, and the air took on a damp, earthy smell. We were descending into a ravine I hadn't noticed on our hike-in. "Wes wouldn't come this way," Blake said. "It doesn't make any sense." He was right. The terrain was becoming increasingly difficult to navigate, fallen trees blocking our path, thick undergrowth grabbing at our ankles, the ground itself seeming to shift and give way beneath our weight. And yet, Wes's voice continued to draw us forward, each call slightly clearer, slightly more recognizable than the last. "I found something! You won't believe this!" It was the excitement in his tone that kept us going. Whatever he discovered, it sounded important enough to justify his strange behavior. The ravine bottomed out in what appeared to be a dry creek bed, strewn with smooth stones and fallen branches. The air was noticeably cooler here, and unnaturally still. No breeze stirred the leaves overhead, no insects hummed among the rocks. "Wes?" I called again, my voice echoing slightly against the ravine walls. Silence answered me. "I don't like this," Kathy said, gripping her makeshift weapon tighter. "We need to go back." Even as she spoke, a noise emanated from further down the creek bed, a deliberate shifting of stones, as if someone were carefully picking their way across the rocky terrain. "There!" Blake pointed toward a bend in the ravine where the creek bed disappeared from view. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of movement. A figure rounding the corner, just far enough away that details were impossible to discern. It could have been Wes. It could have been anyone. "Wes, stop!" I shouted, frustration overcoming fear. "This isn't funny anymore." The figure paused, half hidden by a large boulder. Then slowly a hand appeared from behind the rock, waving us forward in a come-hither gesture. "That's not Wes," Kathy stated definitively. "I'm not going any further." Blake nodded in agreement. "We need to get back to camp, grab our stuff, and get out of here." I hesitated, torn between the need to find our friend and the growing certainty that we were being deliberately led astray. The figure behind the boulder remained motionless, waiting for our decision. "Wes," I called one final time. "If that's you, come out where we can see you." The hand disappeared. Seconds later, Wes's voice, now noticeably different, with a hollow quality that raised the hair on my arms, floated around the bend. "Come see." That was enough. Without discussion, the three of us began backing away, then turned and scrambled up the slope we had descended. The climb was more difficult than I expected, the soil crumbling beneath our feet, roots and rocks seeming to appear in our path that hadn't been there during our descent. Behind us, sounds of pursuit, light, quick footsteps on stone, then the rustle of vegetation as whatever had been impersonating Wes began to climb after us. "Faster!" I urged, helping Kathy over a particularly steep section. We crested the ravine, breathless and trembling, and plunged back into the forest, no longer concerned with direction, focused only on putting distance between ourselves and the thing below. After several minutes of frantic running, we paused to catch our breath and get our bearings. "Did we lose it?" Blake gasped, bent double with his hands on his knees. I strained to listen past the sound of our own labored breathing. The forest had returned to its unnatural silence. "I think so," I whispered. "But we need to find our way back to camp." Kathy fumbled in her pocket and produced a small compass. I think the clearing was northeast of the ravine. We oriented ourselves and began walking, more carefully now, alert for any sign of pursuit. The woods seemed to have changed somehow. The trees more twisted, the undergrowth more tangled. Nothing looked familiar. "This is impossible," Blake muttered after 20 minutes of increasingly disoriented wandering. "We can't have gone that far from camp." An unsettling thought occurred to me. What if the camp wasn't there anymore? What if nothing in these woods stayed in the same place? I pushed the idea away. There had to be a rational explanation. We were tired, frightened, and disoriented. That was all. "Let's try calling for Wes again," I suggested. "The real Wes." Blake nodded. "Wes," he shouted. "Where are you, man?" We waited, listening intently. Nothing. Then Kathy gasped, pointing toward a break in the trees ahead. "Look." Sunlight streamed through the gap, bright enough to suggest a clearing. Relief surged through me. "The camp," I exclaimed, hurrying forward. But as we emerged from the trees, it wasn't our campsite that greeted us. Instead, we found ourselves at the edge of a vast cornfield, stalks standing tall and unnaturally still in the morning light. "This is wrong," Blake said, stating the obvious. "We didn't come through a cornfield this big." "Actually," I said slowly, recognizing something about the landscape, "I think we did. This is the way back to the car." Kathy's eyes widened. "But what about Wes? What about our gear?" I scanned the edge of the forest, searching for any sign of our friend or the thing that had been impersonating him. Nothing moved among the trees. "We need help," I decided. "We'll go back to the car, drive to town, and get the police or park rangers or whoever has jurisdiction here." Neither of them argued. The prospect of returning to civilization, of escaping these woods, was too tempting to resist. We entered the cornfield cautiously, the stalks brushing against our shoulders as we forged a path through them. The ground felt damp beneath our feet, each step producing a soft, squelching sound. Halfway through the field, Blake suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" We listened. From somewhere behind us came the sound of corn stalks being parted, as if someone, or something, was following our path through the field. "Run," I whispered. We abandoned caution, plowing through the remaining stalks with desperate energy. The rustling behind us accelerated, keeping pace. Just when it seemed our pursuer would overtake us, we burst from the edge of the field onto a narrow dirt road. Without pausing, we sprinted toward where we had parked the car the previous day. The vehicle sat exactly where we'd left it, looking impossibly normal and out of place after what we'd experienced. Wes's keys were still in my pocket. He'd given them to me for safekeeping when we set up camp. We piled into the car, locking the doors behind us. The cornfield stood placid and innocuous in the morning sun, showing no signs of disturbance despite our frantic passage through it. "What about Wes?" Blake asked as I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered to life, and I felt a wave of relief so intense it made my hands shake on the steering wheel. "We'll get help," I promised. "Real help." As I pulled onto the main road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For an instant, I thought I saw a figure standing at the edge of the field, a silhouette that might have been Wes, watching us drive away. Then we rounded a curve, and the cornfield disappeared from view. The local sheriff's office was a small brick building with an American flag hanging limply from a pole out front. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of coffee and floor polish. A dispatcher looked up from her computer as we burst through the door. "We need help," I blurted out. "Our friend is missing in the woods off County Road 17. The dispatcher, her nameplate read Torres, regarded us calmly. "When did this happen?" "This morning," Kathy explained, more coherently than I could manage. "We were camping. He disappeared while keeping watch." Torres picked up a phone. "I'll get Sheriff Dawson." While we waited, I became acutely aware of our appearance, disheveled, dirty, wild-eyed. We must have looked like lunatics or drug addicts. I tried to smooth down my hair and brushed some of the dirt from my clothes. Sheriff Dawson emerged from a back office moments later. He was older than I expected, maybe mid-60s, with a weathered face and alert eyes that sized us up immediately. "You folks lose someone in Harmon Woods?" he asked, gesturing for us to sit in the plastic chairs against the wall. "Is that what they're called?" Blake asked. "We just knew they were off County Road 17. The sheriff nodded. "That's Harmon Woods. Not really a camping area, though folks do it sometimes." He pulled out a notepad. "Tell me exactly what happened." We took turns explaining. Arriving yesterday afternoon, setting up camp, the strange sounds during the night, Wes's disappearance, the voice that led us deeper into the forest. As we spoke, Dawson's expression remained neutral, but I noticed his pen stopped moving about halfway through our account. "So, let me get this straight," he said when we finished. "You heard what sounded like your friend's voice calling you, but you don't think it was actually him?" Put that way, it sounded ridiculous. I nodded anyway. "And you left all your gear there? Tents, supplies, everything?" "We panicked," Kathy admitted. "We just wanted to get help." Dawson sighed, tucking his notepad away. "I'll send a deputy out with you to look for your friend and your gear. But I should tell you, folks get turned around in those woods all the time. The terrain's tricky, lots of ravines and hills that all look the same. Easy to lose your bearings." "But the voice," Blake insisted. Something was mimicking Wes. "Probably an echo," Dawson suggested. "Sound bounces around in those ravines. Or maybe it was your friend, disoriented from lack of sleep. You said he was on watch all night?" I wanted to argue, but stopped myself. What was the alternative explanation? That something supernatural had lured us through the woods? That Wes had been taken by some malevolent forest entity? "When can we go back?" I asked instead. "Deputy Miller can take you now. I'll put out a description of your friend to our patrols." He eyed us sympathetically. "Try not to worry too much. People wander off in those woods fairly regularly. Usually turn up by nightfall, confused but fine." Deputy Miller was younger than the sheriff, maybe 30, with the built physique of a former athlete now going slightly soft around the middle. He drove us back to where we'd parked in his patrol SUV, asking questions about Wes's appearance and what he had been wearing. "Sheriff's right about these woods," he commented as we turned onto the dirt road leading to our parking spot. "They can play tricks on your mind, especially if you're tired or scared." "We weren't hallucinating," Kathy said firmly. Miller raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Never said you were. Just that the mind fills in gaps sometimes, makes connections that aren't there." We reached the spot where Wes's car still sat. The morning had advanced to early afternoon, the sun now high overhead, baking the dirt road and surrounding fields in uncomfortable heat. "All right," Miller said, checking his sidearm and flashlight. "You folks point me toward your campsite, but stay close. These woods are easy to get lost in." We retraced our steps through the cornfield, which looked far less menacing in the full light of day. The stalks rustled gently in the occasional breeze, creating whispered conversations that no longer seemed threatening. At the forest's edge, I hesitated. Despite the daylight, despite the armed deputy beside us, something about those trees repelled me. The shadows beneath them seemed too deep, too absolute. "It's this way," I forced myself to say, pointing along what I hoped was the path we'd taken the day before. Deputy Miller took the lead, moving confidently through the underbrush. We followed closely, our earlier fear tempered by his presence but not eliminated. The woods felt different in daylight, less actively malevolent, more indifferently dangerous. Birds called overhead, insects buzzed among the leaves, and occasionally small animals rustled in the underbrush. All the normal sounds that had been absent the night before. After 20 minutes of hiking, Miller stopped. "You sure this is the right way? These trails branch a lot." I wasn't sure at all, but I nodded anyway. "I think so." The clearing was large enough for 2 tents. We continued, the forest growing denser, the ground beginning to slope upward. Something about the terrain felt familiar, yet wrong somehow, like seeing a familiar room with all the furniture rearranged. This doesn't look right, Blake muttered beside me. We weren't going uphill yesterday. Before I could respond, Kathy grabbed my arm. Listen. We all fell silent. From somewhere ahead came a faint sound, a rhythmic tapping, like wood against wood. Could be your friend, Miller suggested, hand resting on his holster. Let's check it out. The tapping led us to another clearing, smaller than the one where we'd camped. In its center stood a weather-beaten wooden post, about 4 feet tall, with what looked like old fishing line attached to it. The line extended to several smaller sticks arranged in a rough circle around the post. The breeze caught the contraption, causing the sticks to swing and tap against the central post, the source of the sound we'd heard. What is that? Blake asked, voicing our collective confusion. Miller approached it cautiously. Some kind of homemade weather vane, maybe? Or a hunting blind? He examined it more closely. It's old, though. Been here a while. I scanned the clearing, searching for any sign of human presence. Food wrappers, cigarette butts, footprints. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed except around the wooden construct. This isn't where we camped, I stated unnecessarily. Miller straightened up. Must have taken a wrong turn. Can any of you get your bearings from here? None of us could. The forest looked identical in every direction. Same trees, same undergrowth, same filtered light creating dancing patterns on the forest floor. Let's try going back to the cornfield and starting over, Miller suggested. Maybe approach from a different angle. As we turned to leave, the tapping accelerated, despite no noticeable increase in the breeze. The sound grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to capture our attention. Miller frowned. That's odd. Let's go, Kathy urged, already backing toward the path we'd used to enter the clearing. We retraced our steps, moving more quickly now. The tapping faded behind us, replaced once again by the normal sounds of the forest. But as we walked, a new sound gradually became apparent. Voices, distant but distinct, engaged in what sounded like playful conversation. That could be campers, Miller suggested, changing direction to move toward the sound. Maybe friends of your missing buddy. The voices led us to yet another clearing, this one immediately recognizable. This is it, Blake exclaimed. This is where we camped. Our tents stood exactly as we'd left them, our supplies arranged around the cold fire pit. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed. Wes? I called out, a surge of hope rising in my chest. Are you here? No response. But the voices we'd heard continued, now seemingly coming from just beyond the trees at the far side of the clearing. Miller drew his weapon. Stay here, he instructed, moving cautiously toward the source of the sounds. We watched as he disappeared into the trees, his uniform quickly swallowed by shadows. The voices abruptly ceased. Minutes passed. The clearing felt exposed, vulnerable. I fought the urge to flee back to the road, to the car, to anywhere but here. He's been gone too long, Kathy whispered. Something's wrong. As if summoned by her words, Miller emerged from the trees, his expression troubled. Find anything? I asked, already knowing the answer from his face. He holstered his weapon slowly. Nothing, no people, no signs of anyone passing through. He paused. But I found this. From his pocket he produced a wallet, worn brown leather, familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. That's Wes's, Blake confirmed, reaching for it. Miller handed it over. It was just lying on the ground, about 50 yards in, like someone dropped it. Blake opened the wallet with trembling hands. Everything was intact. Driver's license, credit cards, a few $20 bills. Why would he leave his wallet? Kathy asked, voicing the question we were all thinking. And where did those voices go? I added. We all heard them. Miller frowned. I didn't hear any voices when I was in there, just regular forest sounds. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature settled over me. I looked at Blake and Kathy, saw the same realization in their eyes. The deputy hadn't heard the voices because they weren't meant for him. "We need to pack up and go," I said firmly. "Now." Miller didn't argue. "Probably wise. I'll call this in, get a proper search party organized." We hurriedly dismantled the tents and gathered our supplies, working with desperate efficiency. No one ventured to the edge of the clearing alone, and we all pointedly ignored the occasional whispers that seemed to emanate from just beyond the tree line. As we finished packing, I noticed something odd about the fire pit. A small object nestled among the ashes that hadn't been there before. Carefully, I reached down and retrieved it. Wes's lighter, the custom Zippo with his initials engraved on the side. I showed it to the others without comment. We all understood its significance. Wes had been here, in our camp, while we were gone. The hike back to the road felt interminable. Every shadow concealed potential threats. Every natural sound masked potential pursuers. Miller led the way, his earlier confidence noticeably diminished. When we finally emerged from the forest, the late afternoon sun momentarily blinded us. The cornfield stretched before us, golden and swaying gently in the breeze. "I thought I heard something," Miller said suddenly, turning back toward the forest. "Like someone calling." The three of us exchanged glances. None of us had heard anything. "It's just the wind," Kathy said quickly, tugging at his sleeve. "Let's go." Miller hesitated, staring into the trees with an intensity that made me nervous. Then he shook his head, as if clearing it. "Right. The wind." We hurried through the cornfield, our pace just short of running. Behind us, the forest stood silent and watchful, revealing nothing of its secrets. The search for Wes continued for 3 days. Teams of volunteers combed the woods, working outward from our campsite in an ever-expanding grid pattern. Dogs were brought in, their handlers confident they could track any human scent for miles. But the dogs refused to enter certain areas of the forest. They would whine and pull at their leashes, ears flattened against their heads, refusing to advance no matter how their handlers coaxed them. I stayed involved in the search efforts, partly out of guilt, partly out of a desperate need to understand what had happened. Blake and Kathy visited the command post daily, but avoided returning to the woods themselves. On the 4th day, Sheriff Dawson called us to his office. "We're scaling back the search," he informed us, his expression grave. "We've covered every inch of those woods, multiple times. If your friend was there, we would have found him." "So what are you saying?" Blake demanded. "That he just vanished?" Dawson sighed. "People go missing in these parts. Not often, but it happens. Usually there's an explanation. They get lost, fall into a ravine, sometimes even decide to disappear on purpose." "Wes wouldn't do that," Kathy insisted. "And if he'd fallen, your teams would have found him." "Unless he wasn't in the woods anymore," I said quietly, the thought that had been forming in my mind for days finally taking shape. "What if he went somewhere else?" Dawson gave me a strange look. "Like where?" I struggled to articulate what I was thinking without sounding completely unhinged. "I don't know. But there's something wrong with those woods. The way sounds travel there. The way you can get lost in a relatively small area. The voices we heard." "Stress and exhaustion," Dawson suggested gently. "Makes the mind play tricks." "All 3 of us experienced the same tricks?" Blake challenged. "Mass hysteria is a documented phenomenon," Dawson replied. "Look, I'm not dismissing what you folks went through, but I've been sheriff here for 22 years. These woods have a reputation, sure, but there's nothing supernatural about them." I wasn't convinced. Has anyone else gone missing there? Besides Wes? Something flickered across Dawson's face, hesitation, perhaps, or reluctance. "There have been incidents. Hikers who got turned around, hunters who came out with strange stories." "And people who never came out at all?" I pressed. Dawson leaned back in his chair, studying us for a long moment. Finally, he sighed. "3 cases in my time as sheriff. all ruled as probable accidents or voluntary disappearances. But yes, people who went in and were never found. The admission hung in the air between us, confirming our worst fears while explaining nothing. I want to see the case files, I said, surprising even myself with the demand. That's not possible, Dawson replied automatically. Those are confidential police records. Our friend is missing, Kathy interjected. If there's a pattern, something that could help find him. There is no pattern, Dawson interrupted firmly. Just unfortunate coincidences. But his eyes betrayed him. A flicker of uncertainty, a hint of something he wasn't telling us. What about before your time? Blake asked quietly. Any local legends about the woods? Stories passed down? Dawson stood up, signaling the end of our conversation. I'm sorry about your friend. Truly. We'll keep looking, but you folks should prepare yourselves for the possibility that we may never know exactly what happened to him. As we left the sheriff's office, a new determination settled over me. If Dawson wouldn't share what he knew, I would find someone who would. The town library was our next stop, a small building with an impressively comprehensive local history section. The elderly librarian, Mrs. Walsh, was initially hesitant to help when we explained what we were looking for. Harmon Woods has always been part of this town, she said, shelving books as she spoke. Nothing special about them. We're just trying to understand the area better, I explained, deliberately vague. Any historical information would be helpful. Something in my tone must have convinced her, because she led us to a back room filled with archived newspapers and local records. If you're looking for history, it's all here, she said, gesturing to the shelves. Though I don't know what you expect to find. For hours, we sifted through dusty files and faded newspaper clippings. Most contained nothing of interest. Town council meetings, harvest reports, birth and death announcements spanning decades. Then Blake found something, a newspaper article from 1967, yellowed with age, but still legible. Listen to this, he said, smoothing the paper on the table. Local man claims discovery in Harmon Woods. It says a man named Edward Harmon, must be related to the Woods' namesake, claimed to have found evidence of previous habitation in the forest. He described stone foundations and unusual artifacts that predated European settlement. Any details about where exactly? I asked, leaning closer. Blake scanned the article. Not specifically, just that it was deep within the most remote section of the woods. Keep looking, Kathy urged. There might be follow-up articles. We renewed our search with increased focus, now looking specifically for mentions of Edward Harmon or unusual discoveries in the woods. An hour later, I found what we were looking for, a small article dated 2 weeks after the first. Harmon expedition returns empty-handed. The piece described how Edward Harmon had led a group of 5 men into the woods to document his discovery, only to return confused and disoriented after 3 days, claiming they could not relocate the site. The article had a dismissive tone, suggesting Harmon had either fabricated his initial claims or had been confused about what he saw. There's something else, Kathy said, holding up a brittle page from what appeared to be a local historical journal. This is from 1972. It mentions that Edward Harmon disappeared 5 years after his failed expedition. He left a note saying he was returning to find the truth, and was never seen again. A chill ran through me. So he went back to the woods. And never came out, Blake finished. We continued our research, finding scattered references to Harmon Woods throughout the decades, incidents of hunters reporting strange sounds, hikers becoming inexplicably disoriented, even a brief mention of a scientific study in the 1980s that was abandoned for unspecified reasons. But the most disturbing discovery came from a hand-bound collection of local folklore compiled by a high school history teacher in the 1990s. Among stories of haunted houses and Civil War ghosts was a section titled, The Watchers of Harmon Woods. The account described how, according to local Native American tribes, the area now known as Harmon Woods had once been considered sacred ground, not a place of worship, but a boundary between worlds that should not be crossed. They believed the forest contained doorways, I read aloud, through which entities they called the Watchers could observe our world. These beings were said to be curious about humans, sometimes mimicking their voices or appearances to lure them deeper into the woods and closer to the doorways. Blake's face had gone pale. That sounds exactly like what happened with Wes's voice. I continued reading. Those who ventured too close to a doorway risked being pulled through to the other side. Not dead, but no longer in our world. The tribes avoided the area entirely, considering it too dangerous even for their most experienced hunters. Kathy shuddered. This is just a folktale, right? It can't be real. But we all knew it matched our experience too closely to dismiss entirely. There's more, I said, turning the page. When European settlers arrived, they ignored the warnings and built homes near the woods. Several disappearances occurred before they finally abandoned the area. The foundations of their homes supposedly remain somewhere in the forest, marking places where the boundary between worlds is thinnest. The stone foundations Harmon claimed to find, Blake muttered. I closed the book, my mind racing. We need to go back. Are you insane? Kathy hissed. After everything we just read? That's exactly why we need to go back, I insisted. If there's any chance Wes is still alive, still somewhere in those woods, or beyond them, we have to try to find him. And how exactly do we do that? Blake demanded. Wander around until we find a magical doorway to another dimension? We find the foundations, I replied, surprising myself with my certainty. The article said Harmon couldn't relocate them when he went back with others. But what if they're only visible under certain conditions? Or to certain people? This is crazy, Kathy muttered, but I could tell she was considering it. Maybe, I admitted. But what's our alternative? Except that Wes is gone forever and we'll never know why. Blake ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration familiar from years of friendship. If, and this is a massive if, these stories have any truth to them, wouldn't we be risking the same fate as Wes? Not if we're prepared, I argued. We know what to look for now. We know not to follow voices or strange sounds. We stay together, no matter what. Kathy and Blake exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. When? Kathy asked finally. Tomorrow, I replied. Early morning. We go straight to our old campsite and work outward from there. As we left the library, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the town. I felt watched, although when I turned to look, there was nothing there, just empty sidewalks and closed storefronts. That night, in my motel room, I dreamed of Wes. He was standing in a clearing I didn't recognize, surrounded by trees that seemed wrong somehow. Too tall, too straight, too still. He was calling my name, but when I tried to reach him, the distance between us remained constant no matter how fast I ran. When I awoke, gasping and disoriented, my room was filled with pre-dawn light. On the floor beside my bed lay Wes's lighter, the same one I'd found in the ashes of our campfire. I was certain I had left it in my jacket pocket, hanging in the motel room closet. We met at a diner on the edge of town, ordering breakfast none of us would eat. The waitress noticed our tense expressions and subdued conversation. You folks with the search party? She asked, refilling our coffee cups. For that missing camper? I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Terrible thing, she continued, oblivious to our discomfort. But those woods, people around here know better than to go too deep. What do you mean? Blake asked, suddenly alert. The waitress shrugged. Just stories. My grandma used to say those trees had eyes. Silly superstition. She moved on to another table, leaving us with our cooling food and troubling thoughts. We drove separately this time, a precaution in case something happened to one vehicle. The morning was overcast, a layer of thin clouds diffusing the sunlight into a gray haze that seemed appropriate for our mission. At the edge of the forest, we double-checked our supplies, flashlights with extra batteries, compasses, though we all doubted their reliability in these woods. Whistles, first aid kits, water, energy bars. I had also brought a digital recorder to document our experience, I told the others, though privately, I hoped it might capture something we couldn't perceive with our ordinary senses. We stay together, I reminded them as we prepared to enter the trees. No matter what we hear or see, we don't separate. They nodded solemnly. We had agreed not to inform the sheriff of our plans. He would only try to stop us. And after days of fruitless searching, the official response had dwindled to occasional patrols that rarely ventured far from the established trails. The forest felt different this time, watchful, but not immediately threatening. Birds called overhead, insects buzzed among the underbrush, small animals rustled through fallen leaves. Normal woodland sounds that had been absent during our previous visit. We followed what we believed was the path to our old campsite, though the terrain seemed subtly altered. Hills slightly steeper, ravines slightly deeper, distances slightly longer than I remembered. Something's wrong, Kathy said after we had been walking for over an hour. We should have reached the campsite by now. She was right. Even accounting for our circuitous route during the initial hike, we should have found the clearing where we'd set up camp. Let's try a different approach, I suggested. Instead of looking for the campsite, let's look for signs of the foundations mentioned in the articles. And how do we do that? Blake asked, frustration evident in his voice. The woods cover miles of terrain. I hesitated, uncertain how to explain the intuition guiding me. I think we need to let the forest show us. What does that even mean? Kathy demanded. It means we stop trying to impose our will on this place, I explained, struggling to articulate my thoughts. Stop trying to force it to make sense according to our rules. If there's something here that defies normal explanation, we won't find it through normal methods. Blake looked skeptical, but Kathy nodded slowly. Like how dowsers claim to find water. They don't search logically. They make themselves receptive to something they can't explain. Exactly, I agreed, relieved someone understood. So we walk, but with intention. We're looking for Wes, for answers, for anything that feels different. It sounded ridiculous when said aloud, but to my surprise, neither of them ridiculed the idea. Perhaps they too had sensed the strange logic governing these woods. We continued walking, but with a new awareness. Less focused on specific landmarks, more attuned to subtle shifts in the atmosphere around us. I found myself drawn in a particular direction, though I couldn't have explained why if asked. The terrain gradually changed, becoming rockier and more uneven. The trees grew older, their trunks broader, their canopies more expansive. Less undergrowth cluttered the forest floor, as if the massive trees had claimed all available resources for themselves. It's cooler here, Blake observed, zipping up his jacket. And quieter. He was right. The ambient sounds of the forest had diminished, replaced by an expectant silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. We crested a small rise and found ourselves looking down into a shallow depression about 50 yards across. At its center stood the remains of what might once have been a building, just a few courses of weathered stone forming a rough rectangle, partially covered by moss and fallen leaves. The foundations, Kathy whispered, her voice barely audible. We approached cautiously, half expecting something to emerge from the trees and block our path. Nothing did, but the silence intensified, becoming almost physical in its presence. The stone remnants were clearly old, centuries rather than decades. They formed the outline of what must have been a small cabin or outbuilding. Inside the rectangle, the ground was bare earth, devoid of the fallen leaves and plant growth that covered the surrounding area. Look at this, Blake called, kneeling beside one section of the foundation. He brushed away accumulated debris, revealing symbols carved into one of the stones, crude but deliberate markings that resembled neither letters nor numbers, but something more primal. They're all around the perimeter, Kathy noted, moving from stone to stone. Like a boundary. I stepped inside the rectangle, half expecting some dramatic reaction. A flash of light, a sudden wind, a tearing of reality. Nothing happened. Yet I felt a subtle difference, as if the air inside the boundary had a different quality. Thinner somehow. Less substantial. Guys, I said, my voice sounding flat and lifeless in the strange acoustic of the space. I think this is it. This is one of the doorways. Blake remained outside the rectangle, clearly reluctant to cross the boundary. So what now? We just wait? We call for Wes, I decided. But carefully. We're not trying to open anything or cross over, just making contact. Kathy joined me inside the rectangle, while Blake remained outside, ready to pull us back if necessary. Wes? I called, loudly but not shouting. Can you hear us? My voice fell dead in the still air, absorbed rather than echoing. We're here to help you, Kathy added. If you can give us a sign, anything at all. Silence answered us, profound and expectant. I activated the digital recorder, holding it out before me like a talisman. Wes, if you can hear this recording, give us some indication. Make a sound. Say something. Anything to let us know you're there. Still nothing. I was beginning to feel foolish, standing in the ruins calling out to empty air, when Blake suddenly stiffened. Did you hear that? He whispered. I hadn't heard anything, but the hair on my arms was standing on end, responding to something beyond conscious perception. Play back the recording, Kathy suggested. I rewound the digital recorder and pressed play. Our voices came through clearly, followed by several seconds of silence. Then, just barely audible, a whisper. Help me. We froze, looking at each other with wide eyes. Play it again, Blake urged, now stepping into the rectangle to hear better. I did. This time we all heard it. Wes's voice, distant but recognizable, pleading for help. Where are you? I called out, recording again. How can we reach you? We waited, then played back the recording. Nothing but our own voices this time. Maybe it's not consistent, Kathy suggested. Or maybe we need to do something specific to strengthen the connection. Like what? Blake asked. Hold hands? Chant? Sacrifice a small animal? The attempt at humor fell flat in the oppressive atmosphere. The lighter, I said suddenly, remembering. Wes's lighter that I found in the ashes, then again in my motel room. I pulled it from my pocket, a simple silver Zippo with Wes's initials engraved on one side. It felt unusually heavy in my hand, and colder than the surrounding air would explain. I think it's a link, I continued, the idea forming as I spoke. Something that connects our world with wherever Wes is now. So what do we do with it? Kathy asked. I hesitated, unsure. Everything we were doing was based on intuition and folklore, not any established procedure. There was no guidebook for communicating across dimensional boundaries. Let's try something, I said finally. I placed the lighter on the ground at the center of the rectangular foundation and stepped back. Wes, if you can hear us, use this to show us you're there. Move it, light it, anything. We watched the lighter, barely breathing. Seconds stretched into minutes with no response. Then, just as I was about to give up, a breeze stirred within the rectangle, a localized movement of air that didn't touch the surrounding forest. The lighter skidded slightly across the bare earth, rotating to point toward the northern edge of the foundation. Holy shit, Blake whispered. Did you see that? Before I could respond, the temperature around us plummeted. Our breath became visible in sudden clouds of vapor. The lighter moved again, more deliberately this time, spelling out a pattern in the dirt. Here. Wes, I called, my voice shaking. Are you here with us now? The lighter flipped over, then righted itself, as clear a nod as was possible for an inanimate object. Are you alive? Kathy asked hesitantly. Another flip and right, yes. Are you trapped? Blake added. Yes. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. How do we get you out? How do we help you? The lighter began to move more rapidly, scratching letters into the dirt. Daunted paused. then continued. Come another pause. Through. We exchanged glances, the implications sinking in. Wes was warning us against attempting to reach him. Is there another way? I asked. Can you come back the way you went in? No. Are you alone there? Kathy's question made me realize I hadn't considered that possibility. That Wes might not be the only one trapped on the other side. The lighter hesitated, then spelled Watchers. A chill that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature ran through me. The entities from the folklore, the ones who observed our world and sometimes lured people across the boundary. Are they hurting you? I managed to ask. No. Studying. The word appeared slowly, deliberately. Studying you? For what purpose? Blake asked. The lighter didn't move for several seconds. Then, curious. An absurd answer that somehow made perfect sense. If these entities were truly from another dimension or reality, human beings would be as strange to them as they were to us. Can they hear us now? Kathy whispered. The lighter moved again. Always watching. As if in response to this revelation, I felt a prickling sensation across my skin, an awareness of observation so intense it was almost physical. The forest around us had gone completely silent. Not even the sound of wind in the leaves disturbed the unnatural stillness. We need to get you out, I insisted, addressing both the lighter and whatever unseen presence might be listening. Tell us how. Can't leave. Why not? Blake demanded. Are they keeping you prisoner? Not prisoner choice. The implication stunned me. You chose to stay, willingly? Yes. Why, Wes? Kathy's voice broke. Why would you choose to stay there? The lighter moved again, more urgently now. Learning secrets, truth. The words chilled me more than any threat could have. Wes had always been the most intellectually curious of our group, constantly questioning, constantly seeking deeper understanding. If these Watchers had offered him knowledge beyond our world. When are you coming back? I asked, already suspecting the answer. Not. The air within the rectangle was now so cold it burned my lungs with each breath. The lighter's movements became more erratic, as if the connection was weakening. Wes, please, Kathy pleaded. Whatever they showed you, whatever they promised, it's not worth losing everything here. The lighter paused, then spelled one final message. Go now, danger. We're not leaving without you, I insisted. But even as I spoke, the lighter flared to life on its own, the flame burning unnaturally tall and blue-white. In its light, I glimpsed something, a distortion in the air above the foundation, like heat waves rising from hot asphalt, but more structured, more intentional. And within that distortion, for just an instant, I saw faces, not human faces, not animal faces, but something that contained elements of both while being fundamentally neither. They observed us with an intensity that felt like physical pressure, their attention an almost tangible force. We need to go, Blake said urgently, grabbing my arm. Now. The rational part of my mind agreed, but something else, some impulse I couldn't name, made me reach for the lighter, intending to take it with us. As my fingers touched the metal, a shock ran through my body like an electrical current. The world tilted sideways, and for one terrifying moment, I saw both realities simultaneously, our forest and another place, overlaid like double-exposed film. That other place was similar to our world, but fundamentally wrong. The trees grew in geometric patterns no natural evolution would produce. The sky held colors that human eyes weren't designed to process, and moving among it all were the Watchers, their forms fluid and constantly shifting. In that instant of connection, I understood why Wes had chosen to stay. The knowledge available there was vast, revealing the universe as infinitely stranger and more complex than we had ever imagined. But I also understood the price of that knowledge. To learn those secrets was to become part of them, to be gradually transformed until returning became impossible. Blake and Kathy dragged me backward, breaking my contact with the lighter. reality snapped back into focus, the glimpse of the other world vanishing like a dream upon waking. "Run!" Blake shouted, pulling me to my feet. We fled the clearing, not looking back even as the air behind us seemed to twist and distort, the boundary between worlds momentarily thinning. The forest around us came alive with sound, branches cracking, leaves rustling, voices calling our names in perfect mimicry of people we knew. We ignored them all, running blindly through the trees, focused only on putting distance between ourselves and the Foundation. By some miracle, or perhaps guided by whatever vestiges of humanity remained in Wes, we found our way back to the edge of the woods more quickly than should have been possible. The cornfield stretched before us, normal and reassuring in the afternoon light. We staggered through it, gasping for breath, not stopping until we reached our cars parked by the side of the road. "What do we tell people?" Kathy asked as we leaned against the vehicles, our legs weak from exertion and fear. "Nothing," I replied. "Nothing they would believe anyway." And so we didn't. When Sheriff Dawson asked about our unauthorized return to the woods, we claimed we had been looking for personal items left behind during the official search. When Wes's parents called, desperate for updates, we told them only that we had found no new information. The official search was called off after 2 weeks. Wes was added to the small but significant list of people who had entered Harmon Woods and never emerged. Life in the town returned to normal, the disappearance becoming just another local tragedy, eventually to be reduced to a cautionary tale told around campfires. But the three of us knew the truth, or at least a fragment of it. Wes hadn't vanished. He had crossed over, chosen to remain in that other place with its impossible knowledge and incomprehensible entities. Sometimes in the years that followed, I would wake from dreams of that other world. Vivid, detailed visions that felt more like memories than products of my unconscious mind. In these dreams, Wes was always there, changed, but still recognizable, trying to communicate something vital that I could never quite grasp upon waking. And occasionally, rarely, I would find Wes's lighter, the one we had left behind at the Foundation, sitting on my nightstand or desk or kitchen counter. I never touched it again, never tried to use it as a conduit. Instead, I would carefully place it in a drawer or box, only to find it gone the next time I looked. A reminder, perhaps, that the boundary between worlds is thinner than we imagine, that realities overlap and intertwine in ways our minds aren't equipped to comprehend. Or maybe just Wes's way of letting us know that whatever he had become, some part of him remembered who he had been, and the friends he had left behind. I never returned to Harmon Woods. But sometimes, when I drive past dense forest at twilight, I find myself scanning the tree line, looking for watchers among the shadows, and wondering if they're looking back. I remember when the hills of Pembrokeshire meant nothing but peace to me. Now they're stained with memories I can't erase, tainted by questions I can't answer. My name is Bronwyn Hughes, and I've worked as a critical care nurse at Withybush General Hospital for nearly 8 years. The irregular hours and emotional toll of my profession have always been balanced by the calm I found hiking the majestic Welsh countryside with my border collie, Arth. Arth, whose name means bear in Welsh, was anything but fearful. He confronted the world with a boundless enthusiasm that made even my darkest days brighter. We'd adopted each other 4 years ago when I found him abandoned outside the hospital, trembling and malnourished. The veterinarian estimated he was around 2 years old then, making him a sturdy 6-year-old companion now, or at least he was before that day on Carnangley. My shifts at the hospital often stretched to 14 hours, sometimes longer during emergency situations. The nature of critical care meant I frequently returned home physically exhausted and emotionally drained, having witnessed suffering that most people would struggle to comprehend. This particular week in early May had been especially difficult. We'd lost 2 patients, one elderly man to heart failure and a teenage girl to complications from a car accident. The girl reminded me of my younger sister, with the same delicate features and determined spirit. I'd fought alongside the medical team for hours to stabilize her, but her injuries proved too severe. By Monday, I was operating on minimal sleep and maximal stress. My mother, Gwen, had been looking after Arth during my weekend shift. She lived about 20 minutes away in Haverfordwest and often helped when my schedule became particularly demanding. When she arrived with Arth that Monday afternoon, his excited barking and tail wagging seemed to inject life back into my weary bones. "You look terrible, Cariad," my mother said as she handed me his leash, using the Welsh term of endearment. "Are you sure you don't want to rest before taking him out?" I shook my head, scratching behind Arth's ears as he pressed his body against my legs. "I've been cooped up for days, ma'am. We both need fresh air." She pursed her lips in that way that meant she disagreed but wouldn't press the issue. "At least have some tea before you go gallivanting off." We sat in my small kitchen, steam rising from our cups as she updated me on local gossip and her Women's Institute meetings. All the while Arth paced impatiently by the door, occasionally returning to rest his head on my lap with pleading eyes. All right, I finally conceded, draining the last of my tea. "We're going now." My mother hugged me tightly before leaving. "Don't stay out too late. The weather report mentioned possible rain tonight." I promised we wouldn't, never imagining that rain would be the least of my concerns. The drive to Carn Angley took about 40 minutes from my cottage in Pembroke. As we wound through narrow country lanes, Arth sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, tongue lolling in the breeze. The clock on my dashboard read 7:36 p.m. when we pulled into the small gravel car park at the base of the hill. Carn Angley isn't the highest point in the Preseli Hills, but it's one of the most distinctive. Ancient standing stones mark the remains of an Iron Age fort near its summit, and local legends claim it as a place where Saint Brynech communed with angels in the 6th century. The tourist brochures describe it as mystical and atmospheric, but to locals like me, it was simply a beautiful walking spot with spectacular views of the Irish Sea. I'd visited Carn Angley countless times, in all seasons and weather conditions. I knew its paths intimately, the way the main trail forked about halfway up, with the left path leading to the standing stones and the right winding through a small woodland before emerging near the summit. I knew which sections became muddy after rain and where the best views could be found. Or at least, I thought I knew it. As I gathered our supplies, water bottle, small first aid kit, granola bars, and Arth's favorite tennis ball, I noticed the car park was empty. This wasn't unusual for a Monday evening, especially since most tourists visited during weekends or holiday periods. The isolation never bothered me before. In fact, I preferred having the trails to ourselves. The evening sun hung relatively high, promising at least 2 hours of good light before sunset. May in Wales offers generous daylight, with darkness not fully settling until almost 10 p.m. I had my phone with its built-in torch for the return journey, and the trail was well marked. There was no reason to feel apprehensive as we set off up the gentle slope that marked the beginning of our hike. Yet something felt different this time. The usual sounds of birds seemed muted, the rustling of leaves somehow ominous rather than soothing. I dismissed these impressions as the result of my fatigue and recent emotional strain at work. The scientific part of my brain understood that perception is easily influenced by one's physical and mental state. "Come on, Arth," I called cheerfully, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. "Time for our mega walk." He bounded ahead, stopping occasionally to sniff interesting patches of grass or investigate rabbit holes. His joyful exploration temporarily pushed away my unease, and I followed him up the path, unaware that we were being watched. The initial ascent was pleasant enough. Spring had coaxed an array of wildflowers from the hillside. Clusters of bluebells carpeted the woodland edges, while yellow gorse brightened the more exposed areas. The exertion of climbing gradually loosened the knots of tension in my shoulders, and my breathing fell into a steady rhythm that matched my footsteps. Arth zigzagged ahead, occasionally disappearing from view before reappearing with twigs or interesting stones in his mouth, presenting them to me like treasures. His unbridled joy was infectious, and I found myself smiling for what felt like the first time in days. About halfway up, we paused at a natural platform that offered views across the rolling countryside. Farms appeared as patchwork quilts of green and gold, separated by ancient stone walls and hedgerows. In the distance, the afternoon sun glinted off the Irish Sea, a sliver of silver beneath the vast sky. I uncapped my water bottle, pouring some into a collapsible bowl for Arth before taking a long drink myself. The water was cool against my throat, and I closed my eyes momentarily, savoring the sensation and the whisper of breeze against my skin. When I opened them again, I noticed dark clouds gathering on the western horizon. They were still distant, but moving steadily inland. My mother's warning about rain crossed my mind, but I calculated we had plenty of time to reach the summit and begin our descent before any weather arrived. "What do you think, boy?" I asked Arth, who was now sniffing intently at a clump of heather. "Should we continue to the top?" He looked at me with those intelligent brown eyes, then turned to gaze up the path as if considering the question. After a moment, he barked once and wagged his tail. "I'll take that as a yes," I laughed, repacking our water. We took the right fork in the path, entering the small woodland that flanked the eastern side of Carn Angli. The trees here weren't particularly ancient or large, mostly oak, ash, and hawthorn that had established themselves over the past century or so. But they grew close together, their branches creating a canopy that dappled the afternoon light into shifting patterns on the earth. The path narrowed here, forcing us to walk single file. Arth led the way, occasionally stopping to investigate animal trails that branched off into the undergrowth. The woodland had always been my favorite part of the hike, a secret green world that felt separate from ordinary existence. Today, however, the shadows seemed deeper, the silence more pronounced. No birds called from the branches overhead, no insects buzzed in the undergrowth. Even the wind seemed to have died, leaving the leaves unnaturally still. "Probably going to rain," I murmured to myself, trying to explain away the peculiar atmosphere. Weather changes often affect animal behavior, I reasoned. They were simply seeking shelter before the approaching storm. As we neared the edge of the woodland, where the path would emerge onto the more exposed upper slopes, Arth suddenly stopped. His body became rigid, ears pricked forward, tail motionless. I halted behind him, watching as he tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something beyond human hearing. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, feeling the first real stirring of unease. He didn't respond, remaining frozen in place for several long seconds before abruptly relaxing and continuing forward. I followed, telling myself it was probably a rabbit or fox he'd sensed. Yet the incident left me feeling strangely vulnerable, aware of our isolation in a way I hadn't been before. We emerged from the woodland onto the upper slopes, where the path grew steeper as it approached the summit. The standing stones of the ancient fort were visible now, dark silhouettes against the increasingly dramatic sky. The clouds I'd spotted earlier had drawn closer, transforming the western horizon into a wall of deepening gray. "Just to the top, and then we'll head back," I promised Arth, who had resumed his enthusiastic exploration of the hillside. If only I'd turned back then. If only I'd heeded the warnings, the unnatural silence, Arth's momentary alertness, the gathering storm. But I continued upward, drawn by familiar routine and the promise of that magnificent summit view, unaware that something waited for us among the ancient stones. We reached the summit just as the first distant rumble of thunder rolled across the hills. The standing stones, weathered by countless centuries, stood like ancient guardians around the flattened area that had once been the center of the Iron Age fort. From here, the view was truly spectacular, a panorama of Pembrokeshire stretching to the horizon, with the darkening sea to the west and the patchwork of fields and villages to the east. Under normal circumstances, I would have lingered, perhaps sitting on one of the fallen stones to absorb the tranquility and vastness of the landscape. But the approaching storm and the lateness of the hour urged caution. The sun now hung low, partially obscured by the advancing clouds, casting long shadows across the hilltop. "Let's head back, Arth," I called, turning toward the path. He stood about 20 meters away, near the edge of the summit plateau, his attention focused intently on something I couldn't see. His posture was alert but not alarmed, curious rather than fearful. "Arth!" I called again, more firmly. This time he glanced back at me before returning his gaze to whatever had caught his interest. I sighed, crossing the uneven ground toward him. As I drew closer, I noticed he was looking down the northern slope of the hill. A steeper, more rugged descent than the path we'd climbed. Scattered gorse bushes and occasional boulders dotted this side, creating numerous shadows and hiding places. I peered in the same direction, seeing nothing unusual. "What are you looking at, boy? There's nothing there." But even as I said it, I felt a strange certainty that I was wrong. There was something there. Something watching us from the gathering shadows. The skin at the back of my neck tightened, and I found myself scanning the slope with increasing urgency. A movement caught my eye. Just a flicker at the edge of my vision, gone when I tried to focus on it. Perhaps it was a shadow shifting as clouds passed overhead, or vegetation moving in the strengthening wind. But it left me with an overwhelming sense that we were not alone on the hilltop. "Come on," I said, clipping Arth's lead to his collar. "Time to go." He resisted momentarily, still fixated on the northern slope, before reluctantly allowing me to lead him back toward our ascent path. The wind had picked up significantly, bringing with it the scent of imminent rain. Another rumble of thunder, closer now, emphasized the urgency of our descent. We began retracing our steps, moving more quickly than during our climb. Arth seemed to have forgotten whatever had captured his attention, trotting alongside me with no sign of distress. I, however, couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Several times I turned to look behind us, seeing nothing but the emptying hilltop and darkening sky. The first fat raindrops began to fall as we re-entered the woodland. The canopy provided some shelter, but water still dripped through, pattering against the leaves and earth. The premature darkness beneath the trees made the path harder to follow, and I found myself moving more cautiously, aware of roots and stones that could easily cause a fall. Halfway through the woodland, Arth suddenly stiffened beside me. A low growl built in his throat, not his usual alert bark when spotting wildlife, but something deeper, more primal. The hair along his spine stood erect, and his tail tucked slightly between his legs. I froze, straining my senses against the gathering gloom. Rain tapped against leaves, wind sighed through branches, and beneath these natural sounds, something else, a rustling movement that seemed deliberate rather than random. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding thin and uncertain. "Is someone there?" No response came, yet the sensation of being watched intensified. I fumbled for my phone, activating its torch function. The beam cut through the dimness, illuminating rain-slicked trunks and dripping foliage. I swept it in a slow arc, seeking reassurance in the mundane details of the woodland. The light caught nothing unusual, yet Arth's growl deepened. His body trembled against my leg, communicating fear more eloquently than words ever could. I had never seen him react this way. Not to other dogs, not to strangers, not even during thunderstorms that typically frightened animals. "It's okay," I whispered, trying to convince myself as much as him. "Let's keep moving." We proceeded more quickly now, Arth pressing close against my side. The rain intensified, drumming against the canopy above. Water began running down my face, soaking into my jacket. The path grew slippery underfoot, forcing me to divide my attention between watching for hazards and scanning our surroundings. As we neared the edge of the woodland, where the path would emerge onto the more open lower slopes, Arth abruptly stopped. His growl transformed into a whimper, and he pressed himself against my legs so forcefully I nearly lost my balance. "What is it?" I demanded, directing my torch beam ahead. The light revealed nothing but rain-swept vegetation and the continuation of our path. Yet something had terrified my dog. Something he could sense but I could not perceive. That's when I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm or the woodland. A soft, deliberate scraping, like claws against bark. It came from somewhere to our right, among the densest part of the undergrowth. And then, fleetingly illuminated as my torch beam swept past, 2 points of reflected light, like eyes catching the glow. They vanished immediately, so quickly I couldn't be certain I'd seen them at all. But Arth had no such doubts. His whimper became a yelp of pure terror, and he pulled desperately at his lead, trying to retreat back up the path we'd just descended. "No, Arth," I hissed, tugging him forward. "We need to get out of here." The woodland exit lay just 30 meters ahead. Beyond it, the more open terrain would offer better visibility and, I hoped, safety from whatever lurked among the trees. I urged Arth forward, practically dragging him despite his resistance. We burst from the woodland onto the open slope, rain lashing against us without the barrier of the canopy. The car park was visible in the distance below, a reassuring destination. Arth no longer resisted our forward progress, now seeming as eager as I was to leave the hill behind. As we hurried down the slippery path, I cast one final glance back toward the woodland edge. In the deepening twilight, amplified by the storm clouds, I could distinguish little detail. Yet for an instant I thought I saw a shape detach itself from the shadows, something low to the ground but substantial, moving with deliberate purpose. I didn't wait to confirm the sighting. Clutching Arth's lead, I half ran, half slid down the remainder of the path, pursued by the intensifying storm and something far more terrifying than mere weather. We were about halfway down the lower slope when it happened, the moment that would haunt my dreams for months to come. The rain had eased slightly, though the wind continued to howl around us. Darkness had almost completely enveloped the landscape, with only the faintest glow of twilight remaining on the western horizon. My phone torch provided our only reliable illumination, casting a narrow beam that barely seemed to penetrate the gloom. Arth padded beside me, no longer pulling but still clearly anxious to reach the safety of the car. His fur was soaked, his usually proud tail held low. A hedge bordered this section of the path, an ancient boundary marking the edge of what had once been farmland. Thick hawthorn and blackthorn created an impenetrable barrier alongside us, further narrowing our route of escape. Without warning, Arth erupted into frenzied barking. Not his usual alert bark, but something desperate and terrified. He lunged toward the hedge, straining against his lead with such force that the fabric cut into my palm. "Arth, stop!" I commanded, but he was beyond listening. His barks grew increasingly hysterical as he pulled toward whatever had triggered his reaction. I couldn't see anything beyond the dense tangle of thorny branches, just darkness and the occasional movement of leaves in the wind. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, Arth's barking ceased. A tremor passed through his body, visible even in the dim light. He backed away from the hedge, pressing himself against my legs. A whimper escaped him, a sound of such absolute terror that it sent ice through my veins. I directed my torch toward the hedge, seeing nothing but dripping foliage. Yet Arth continued to retreat, nearly tripping me in his desperation to put distance between himself and whatever lurked beyond. "What is it?" I whispered, scanning the hedgeline. That's when I heard it, a sound unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not quite a growl, not quite a hiss, but something that combined elements of both. It emanated from just beyond the hedge, perhaps 2 meters away. The sound was low, almost subsonic, more felt than heard. Arth collapsed against my legs, trembling violently. To my horror, I realized he was urinating involuntarily, something I'd never seen him do before. Pure terror had overridden every aspect of his training and natural behavior. I swept my torch along the hedge again, desperate for visual confirmation of what threatened us. The beam caught something, a disturbance in the vegetation, branches moving against the wind. Something substantial was pushing through from the other side. Reason told me to identify the threat, to know what we faced. But instinct, more powerful than logic, screamed for immediate flight. I grabbed Arth's lead and tugged, trying to break his paralysis of fear. "Come on," I shouted, no longer concerned about attracting attention. He remained frozen, whining pitifully, his eyes fixed on the hedge. I bent down, awkwardly lifting all 25 kilograms of him. His body was rigid with terror, but he didn't resist being carried. With Arth in my arms, I turned and ran. The path was treacherous with mud and rain, the descent steep enough to make each step precarious. But fear drove me forward, overriding caution. My torch beam bounced wildly, creating disorienting flashes of illuminated ground and vegetation against surrounding darkness. Behind us, the strange sound came again, louder now, and somehow conveying deliberate pursuit. Something crashed through the hedge, twigs breaking and leaves rustling. I didn't look back, focusing every fiber of my being on reaching the car park below. Arth trembled against my chest, his whimpers continuous now. The weight of his sodden body strained my already exhausted muscles, but adrenaline kept me moving. My breathing came in harsh gasps, visible as vapor in the cold night air. The path widened as we neared the bottom, becoming less steep. I risked increasing my pace, aware that the sounds of pursuit had grown fainter. Were we outpacing the threat, or had it simply become more stealthy in its tracking? Finally, the gravel surface of the car park appeared in my torch beam. My vehicle stood alone in the darkness, its familiar shape the most welcome sight I could imagine. I fumbled with the key fob, pressing the unlock button repeatedly until the lights flashed and the locks clicked open. Opening the rear door one-handed while holding Arth was nearly impossible, but fear granted extraordinary coordination. I practically threw him onto the back seat before slamming the door and rushing to the driver's side. Once inside, I locked all doors immediately, gasping for breath as rain plastered my hair to my face. Arth huddled on the back seat, still trembling violently, his eyes wide and unfocused. I turned the key in the ignition, relief flooding through me as the engine roared to life. Headlights illuminated the empty car park and the beginning of the path we'd just descended. Rain slanted through the beams, creating shifting curtains of light and shadow. And there, at the edge of the illumination, something moved. Just for an instant, a dark shape, low and powerful, withdrawing from the light with deliberate purpose. It was gone before I could process details, melting into the darkness beyond the headlight's reach. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning on wet gravel before finding purchase. The vehicle lurched backward, then forward as I changed gear and accelerated toward the access road. Arth whimpered from the back seat as we bounced over potholes, but I couldn't slow down. Not until we were far from Carnangley and whatever had hunted us on its slopes. The journey home passed in a blur of rain-slicked roads and tension. I drove mechanically, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles whitened, eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror despite the logical impossibility of being followed. Arth remained in an unprecedented state of distress. Usually an enthusiastic car passenger, he now lay curled into a tight ball on the back seat, occasionally emitting soft whimpers that tore at my heart. His wet fur soaked into the upholstery, but such concerns seemed trivial compared to his psychological state. By the time we reached my cottage, the rain had diminished to a gentle patter. I parked as close to the door as possible, still irrationally fearful of the short distance between car and house. Arth refused to move from the back seat, forcing me to lift him again and carry him inside. Once in the cottage, I moved through my usual routines with mechanical precision, turning on lights, securing doors and windows, drawing curtains against the night. These ordinary actions provided a semblance of normality, a framework to contain the chaos of emotion threatening to overwhelm me. I placed Arth on his bed near the radiator and examined him thoroughly, medical training temporarily overriding emotional distress. No physical injuries were apparent. No cuts, no thorn scratches, no signs of contact with whatever had frightened him. Yet his behavior remained deeply disturbing. He refused food and water, curling into a tight ball with his nose tucked beneath his tail. After showering and changing into dry clothes, I made tea and sat beside him on the floor, attempting to process what had happened. My rational mind sought explanations that would fit within my understanding of the world. A wild animal seemed the most logical conclusion, perhaps a fox or badger emerging from its den. But neither explanation fully accounted for Arth's extreme reaction. He had encountered wildlife before without showing fear. Furthermore, badgers and foxes typically avoided human contact rather than appearing to pursue it. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay in bed listening to the diminishing rain and Arth's occasional distress sounds from his bed beside mine. When exhaustion finally pulled me under, my dreams were fragmented and unsettling. Shapeless threats pursuing me through darkened woods, and always, that strange sound echoing behind me. Morning brought temporary relief. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the curtains, transforming my bedroom into a space that seemed incapable of harboring fear. Arth appeared somewhat recovered, accepting water and a small amount of food, though still unusually subdued. I called in sick to work, unable to face the prospect of leaving him alone after such trauma. Then I began researching, seeking information that might explain our experience on Carn Angley. My investigation began with local wildlife. Pembrokeshire hosts badgers, foxes, otters, and various deer species, none of which typically present threats to humans or domestic dogs. I searched news reports for unusual animal sightings in the area, finding nothing recent or relevant. Then I broadened my search, typing large predators whales into the search engine. The results were immediately more interesting and disturbing. I discovered numerous reports of big cat sightings across Wales stretching back decades. Most described panther-like creatures, with some accounts mentioning pumas or lynxes. A 2013 article detailed a woman's claim of being chased by a wolf in North Wales. More recently, a news piece from January this year reported puma sightings and people hearing roars while walking dogs at night. The explanation seemed plausible. Exotic pets released into the wild when they grew too large to manage, subsequently breeding and establishing territories in the remote Welsh countryside. The scientific part of my mind acknowledged that such populations could potentially survive undetected in areas of low human habitation. Yet something about this explanation felt incomplete. The behavior I'd witnessed, the deliberate stalking, the sounds unlike any felid I'd ever heard described, didn't align perfectly with big cat behavior as I understood it. After exhausting online resources, I turned to local knowledge. The following day, feeling slightly more composed and with Arth showing signs of recovery, I drove to the village library in Crymick, the nearest settlement to Carn Angley. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Priest, who had worked there for decades, listened to a sanitized version of my experience with unexpected seriousness. "You're not the first to come asking about strange happenings on Carn Angley," she said, leading me to a section of local history books. The hill has a reputation going back centuries. She selected a slim volume titled Folklore of the Preseli Hills and opened it to a chapter on Carn Angley. The text described various legends associated with the location, including St. Brynac's angelic communications. "But here's what might interest you," Mrs. Priest said, pointing to a paragraph near the end of the chapter. The passage described local beliefs from the 18th and 19th centuries that Carn Angley hosted a guardian beast that protected the ancient fort site. According to tradition, this creature remained invisible most of the time, but would reveal itself to those who visited the hill with ill intent or at inauspicious times. "Nonsense, of course," Mrs. Priest said, though her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced of this. "But people around here still avoid the hill after dark. They say animals sense it more easily than humans do." I left the library with more questions than answers, torn between rational explanations and the disturbing resonance of the folklore with my experience. Perhaps the legend had developed precisely because a population of exotic big cats had established themselves in the area generations ago. Yet this explanation still didn't fully account for the profound terror Arth had displayed, a reaction far beyond normal animal fear. Dogs might be cautious around predators, but his complete breakdown suggested something more unsettling. In the days that followed, I researched big cat behavior extensively, learning that they typically avoided humans rather than pursuing them. I joined online forums where people shared similar experiences throughout Wales and broader Britain, finding some comfort in the knowledge that I wasn't alone in my encounter. A week after the incident, with Arth gradually returning to his normal behavior, I visited my veterinarian friend, Rhiannon, seeking her professional perspective. "Animals perceive things differently than we do," she explained after hearing my account. "Their senses are more acute, particularly scent and hearing. What terrified Arth might have been something you couldn't detect at all." "A big cat?" I suggested. She considered this, tapping her pen against her desk. "Possibly. But dogs typically respond to predators with defensive aggression rather than complete terror, especially when their humans are present." "What else could cause such extreme fear?" Rhiannon hesitated. "I'm a scientist, so I should give you a scientific answer. But my grandmother would say that animals sometimes perceive things beyond our understanding, things that exist at the edges of our world. I left her office unsettled by this uncharacteristically mystical statement from my pragmatic friend. Yet her words echoed something I'd been reluctantly considering, that perhaps the explanation lay beyond conventional understanding. 2 weeks after our encounter on Carn Angli, life had largely returned to normal. Arth showed no lasting trauma, resuming his enthusiastic exploration of our regular walking routes, though I carefully avoided anything near the Preseli Hills. Work absorbed my attention, providing welcome distraction from unanswered questions. Yet beneath this semblance of normality, something had fundamentally changed. I found myself more alert to my surroundings, particularly when outdoors at dusk. Strange sounds caused immediate tension, and darkness no longer seemed merely an absence of light, but something potentially harboring unseen presence. I'd almost convinced myself that the incident had a rational explanation, a big cat, perhaps, or even a massive feral dog, when an unexpected encounter challenged this comfortable assumption. I was shopping in Haverfordwest when I encountered Mrs. Priest from the library. After exchanging pleasantries, she mentioned that another walker had reported a frightening experience on Carn Angli just days after my visit. A man from Newport, she explained, walking his Labrador in the early evening, said the dog went berserk near the woodland edge. Same reaction you described. He was sensible enough to leave immediately. Did he see anything? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Mrs. Priest glanced around before lowering her voice. He claims he glimpsed something moving among the trees, said it was large and dark, but moved like nothing he'd ever seen before, not quite like a mammal. Said it seemed to flow rather than run. A cold sensation spread through my chest. Did he report it? To who? The police would think he was mad, and wildlife authorities would dismiss it without evidence. She adjusted her shopping bag. People around here know better than to make official reports. We just warn each other. I thanked her for the information and completed my shopping mechanically, mind racing with implications. Another witness, another terrified dog. The pattern strengthened both the reality of the threat and its mysterious nature. That evening, I found myself searching online for scientific explanations of supposedly supernatural phenomena. Perhaps there were atmospheric or geological conditions on Carn Angli that created infrasound, sound waves below human hearing that could trigger fear responses in both animals and people. Or maybe some unusual electromagnetic phenomenon that animals could perceive but humans could not. These explanations felt like stretching, attempts to force extraordinary experience into ordinary frameworks. Yet the alternative, accepting that something existed beyond current scientific understanding, challenged my fundamental worldview as a medical professional. 1 month after the incident, I made a decision that surprised even me. I would return to Carn Angli, alone this time, in daylight, to confront both the location and my fears. The morning was bright and clear as I parked in the now familiar car park. Other vehicles were present. A retired couple preparing for a walk. A family with young children organizing their backpacks. The normality was reassuring. I chose a different route than before, taking the left fork that led directly to the standing stones rather than through the woodland. The climb was physically demanding but emotionally easier in full daylight, surrounded by occasional fellow hikers. At the summit, I found the stone circle occupied by a tour group, their guide explaining the archaeological significance of the site. I lingered at the periphery, listening to the rational historical narrative that made no mention of beasts or guardians. When the group departed, I approached the largest standing stone, a weathered monolith nearly 3 meters tall. Placing my hand against its rough surface, I tried to connect with the countless generations who had visited this place before me, many of whom must have crafted explanations for their own unexplained experiences. As I stood there, a sudden breeze swept across the summit, carrying an unexpected scent, musty and animal, yet unlike any domestic or common wild species I recognized. My body tensed involuntarily, senses heightening as they had that night. I turned slowly, scanning the open hilltop. Nothing unusual was visible, just grassland, scattered rocks, and the clear paths leading in various directions. Yet the sensation of being observed returned with overwhelming intensity. My gaze was drawn to the edge of the woodland we'd passed through that night. From this elevation, I could see its full extent, a dark green irregularity against the smoother contours of the hillside. Something moved at its periphery, a shadow detaching briefly from deeper shadows before melting back into obscurity. Rational explanation insisted it was merely vegetation moving in the wind, or perhaps a deer seeking shelter. But deeper instinct recognized it as something else, something that didn't belong entirely to the world as I understood it. I didn't flee this time. Standing my ground, I stared toward the woodland edge until the sensation of being watched gradually subsided. Whatever presence had acknowledged me seemed to have withdrawn, perhaps respecting this deliberate daylight encounter differently than our previous nighttime intrusion. On the descent, I reached a resolution of sorts. I would likely never fully understand what hunted the slopes of Carnangli. Scientific explanations felt insufficient, yet I couldn't entirely embrace supernatural ones either. Perhaps some questions weren't meant to be answered conclusively. Perhaps the boundaries between known and unknown, natural and supernatural, were not as clearly defined as modern thinking suggested. Our ancestors had lived with this ambiguity, acknowledging forces beyond their understanding, without needing to categorize them definitively. I could learn to do the same, to accept mystery without surrendering critical thinking, to acknowledge inexplicable experiences without abandoning rational frameworks that served well in most circumstances. Arth and I still take our mega walks regularly, exploring the beautiful Pembrokeshire landscape that remains largely benign and welcoming. But we stay away from Carnangli, especially as daylight wanes. Some boundaries are best respected, some territories best left unchallenged. And on dark nights when wind moves through the trees around my cottage, I sometimes detect that strange sound again. Not quite growl, not quite hiss, carried on the breeze from the direction of the Precelli Hills. I close my curtains tighter then, and Arth presses closer against my leg, both of us acknowledging wordlessly that something watches and waits on Carnangli, something that will likely remain nameless and unexplained. Perhaps that's as it should be. In a world increasingly mapped, measured, and explained, there is perhaps value in these persistent mysteries, these reminders that our understanding remains incomplete, that wonder and terror still inhabit the wild edges of our world, challenging our certainties and reminding us of older truths we have too readily dismissed.